I think before I share my screen and start talking about doing some editing and whatnot, I'd like to talk a little bit about setting your camera up to better capture wildlife images out in the field. And one of the things that I think is really critical is if you're out in a place where you think you're going to encounter wildlife, it often happens unexpectedly. I can't tell you how many times I've been out and there's been an amazing wildlife scene unfolding rapidly in front of me, and I whip my camera out and the settings aren't right, or I don't have it close enough to hand to capture that shot, and it's a fleeting instant and it's gone. So whenever I'm traveling someplace where I think there might be wildlife popping up unexpectedly, I make sure that I've got my camera in shutter priority. I have a fast enough shutter speed. Usually I think about, for birds in flight and things, 1/1500th of a second. If it's low light conditions, you might have to modify that a little bit. I have auto ISO turned on. I have a continuous autofocus mode on whatever camera I'm working with. I think that still right now, the DSLRs are a little bit better for capturing rapidly moving motion. And I'm a huge fan of Nikon's group autofocus for that kind of thing. And I have that just sort of set up so that if something happens, I can pop up and I'm in burst mode. So continuous high-speed capture mode so that I can just fire off a whole bunch of frames. And I think that just being ready like that, if you're hiking along, having some way that you're carrying your camera on your side so that you can get it really quickly. And then those same modes, if you're a person out doing wildlife photography, having a gimbal head or, my preferred type of tripod, like a fluid head, where you can have your camera balanced and, it swings and moves without losing its level, is really, really critical. You can rotate on that lens foot, move around, capture the scene that you want, but track action moving quickly without losing level. That's something that's really difficult to do with a ball head. So those are just some suggestions. Other things are, I think, long prime lenses tend to be really, really nice for wildlife if you're consistently shooting, particularly birds. And, trying out maybe a tele-extender with a long lens. I'm loving some of these newer high-end long fixed lenses. This is Nikon's new little 300 millimeter f4, and it works really well with a 1.4 teleconverter, which kicks it out to about 420 millimeters. And then on crop sensor, that becomes more like 700 millimeters. It's a pretty nice little reach for just being in the palm of your hand. So those are just some tips for kind of being ready, thinking about modes to capture wildlife with. And now I'm going to share my screen and go through some images, and we'll do a little bit of editing. So here we go. All right. So first off, I'm here in PhotoRaw's browse, and I'm going to go into the film strip mode and just show, a few images. I was talking about if you don't have your camera ready, you're going to miss out on images. And there's a few, I've got a few instances where I did just happen to have it ready and something unexpected happened. This is actually on a trip doing some work for the San Francisco Baykeeper. I'm going to go back and do some more work with this spring, I think. But we were out looking at some of the storm drain stuff that they monitor in the San Francisco Bay, and I was doing more portraiture photography with some of their staff people, but we spooked this blue heron totally unexpectedly, and we were in a little wetland right along the 580 freeway, there by Oakland, and this heron was out, and I happened to have all my camera settings right with a 70-200 portrait, lens on my camera. And I just love this image of this heron. This is another situation in Steens Mountain in the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge where, these two geese and this duck just sort of spooked as I was walking along, really looking more at landscape work, but I just love this shot. And this is hiking in Patagonia. This is a Patagonian woodpecker that's about the same size as a pileated woodpecker, really, really beautiful bird. But I was hiking along and I had my camera mounted in a chest pack, and in case I encounter wildlife, there's a lot of fox, there's a lot of beautiful birds, there's condors. I just happen to have the settings, shutter priority, continuous fire, ready to go, and there it was. Another situation out in Lake Victoria where this ibis was running along with a fish in its mouth. And then I want to go through a few images that show how important it is to have burst mode. I was taking photos of this egret. This is again Lake Victoria, Rabundo Island. It's a place that I want to run a workshop in, I think, 2 years. It's just this bird and wildlife paradise. that's hardly has anyone going there. It's pretty amazing. But at any rate, just having that tracking mode, you can see my hero here. I've done some editing on it. Is that as it's just moving from the bushes, and the minute it took off, I just started firing burst with the continuous autofocus tracking, and got that shot right as it's coming in on the rock and landing. So you can see that whole series. And in order to get this one in the middle, it takes those 10 frames. It's moving so fast. That burst mode is really going to help you out when you're working with birds and wildlife. And that brings me to, it's not always about long lenses. It's not always about fast action. Sometimes you've got your wildlife that's beautifully incorporated in the landscape. And I want to showcase, I'm going to do a little live editing here with these two raw files from up in Olympic National Park, which is one of my favorite places to photograph. And I was on a trip up there, let's see, a few years ago, 2014. And I captured these two Nikon D810 images, I'm pretty sure, of this rock with wave action flowing through and these cormorants on the top. But the interesting thing about it is that the birds are in a little bit of motion. If you zoom in, there's 2 frames. This one's relatively sharp. It's still loading the photo. It's a big D810 file. It's sharp enough for a landscape photo, but this one's in motion. So I've got another frame where that one is, as it loads, much sharper, but the other 2 aren't as well framed. And I'm pretty, there's might be a slight bit of motion between the 2 files, but what I want to do is combine them. So I'm going to go here. One of the nice things that I really like in the Browse app in PhotoRaw 2019 is the fact that whenever you want to composite something, whether it's focus stacking, whether it's HDR, panorama, or just jumping into layers with multiple images, you can click these controls right here on the right. So I'm going to jump in here and put these on 2 separate layers. It'll take it a minute to load these 2 big files into the Edit app, but it's brought the first one in here. And I'm going to go to the nav menu here. I want to go ahead and close down this. It's still loading the second one.
Hey, Hudson, quick question for you.
Sure.
Thomas is wondering, do you use back button focus?
I always use back button focus. I am no fan of having the focus button on the shutter, just because there's so many situations where I want to frame in one way and then shift, and I'm moving, working fast, and having to get that focus point always over what I want in focus, so that when I take a photo, it isn't going to interfere with the focus that I've got set. The other thing that I think about back button focus that's really, really nice is that, when you think about having the choice between a static focus mode and a continuous focus mode, if you have the back button focus, you don't need to worry about that. You can just leave it in continuous focus. And when you take your thumb off, it stops focusing. So I don't ever worry about whether I always have my cameras in continuous autofocus mode, because once I find the focus, if I take my thumb off, I don't have to worry about it shifting. I don't have to do that half hold of the shutter button, all those complicated things. It just simplifies the process for me. My thumb is for focusing, my finger is for firing. And I think you're going to find most professional photographers are back button focus aficionados. Maybe there's a few, dedicated bird photographers who are doing the capturing birds in flight. If they're actually working specifically with birds in flight with the group autofocus and close subject priority modes, they might put just for that purpose the shutter focus button, just so it gets even faster. But that's the only reason I could think of. All right. So we've got these 2 layers in here. First thing I want to do is go up into the layer menu, and I want to align visible layers. So I make sure that photo, that they're just perfectly lined up, one over the top of the other. And then I can check that by just turning the top layer off and the bottom layer off. And the other thing I see in here that I like is I've got wave action on the right side of the bottom image and on the left side of the top image. So I can probably combine that too. And all I really need to do to work on this is I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to go to my nav window up at the top panel here. I'm going to zoom in to say 50%. This is a big, 36 megapixel file. That ought to let me see what I'm doing. I'm going to see which birds. Yep. What I want to do is just bring this motion blur bird. I want to just paint it out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my mask icon there. I've got my masking brush, and let's see. I've got, I want to go, my feather is at 100%. I've got these little controls for the webinar that are a little bit in my way here, so apologies for being, there we go. Opacity is 100%, feather is 100%. So that means a nice soft brush. It's not going to have hard edges. And then what I want to do is I want to reduce my brush size. I'm going to take the size down a little bit, make it a little smaller yet. Should be, there we go. I use the bracket keys, and I'm just going to paint that out of focus bird out, which is revealing the focused one down beneath. Then I'm going to go to a fit view. The birds are taken care of, and I want to go ahead and brush in that wave action that's in this image right here. There we go. We've got waves playing up around that rock. And let me have a look here really quick at what's going on. Yep, I think the underlying image is a little bit better for the foreground too. I might as well just paint that whole area in where there's a little more interesting wave action happening around the rocks. And I've just combined those two images to get sharp birds and wave action sort of all at the same time. So the next thing I want to do is create a layer that combines those two layers. That's called a stamped layer. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new stamped layer. And that's going to throw a layer onto my layer stack over here that combines both the underlying layer and that one that I did the masking on, so that then I can finish edit that. I can actually go in and do my develop settings and finish edit settings. We're merging those two. While we wait for that, we got any more questions, Michael?
Yeah, there's a couple questions here, actually. Here's one from Trevor. Is there a preferred angle for you or for wildlife to be photographed at, from the side, front on? Kind of a...
You know, I think that's much more a question about what's going on with the light. I don't like photographing wildlife from behind, obviously. You don't want a bunch of photos of bird bottoms and bear bottoms. I mean, bear bottoms. You want, essentially, no pun intended, you want to be making sure that you think about setting yourself up in a direction where they're going to be facing you or side on. And I think that one thing to think about is which way is the wind blowing. So birds like to face into the wind. So if you've got the wind at your back, you see a lot of bird butts. If you've got the wind, yeah, no, what am I saying? If the wind's at your back, that's going to be straight on them facing you because they don't like their feathers blown backwards. So you actually want the wind to come into your back, which is nice. It's not in your face. If the wind's in your face, you're going to get a lot of bird butts. Birds like to take off and land into the wind, landing into the wind. So if the wind's blowing in from the side, you're going to get nice images with the birds coming in from the side. If the wind's at your back again, you'll get them head on coming at you. Same thing with most animals. Most animals, you know, are gonna not want to be facing out of the wind. So that's just one thing to think about. I like, if I'm going out to a refuge or someplace to photograph at dawn, I like to get there early, and I like to have backlight. A lot of times in wildlife refuges where you've got water and there's mist rising, that backlit sunrise will kind of create this red mist coming up off the water that's all backlit and beautiful. And so for just a little while, getting those shots where the birds are backlit and the sun's rising, you've got maybe a few minutes of just beautiful light and kind of misty conditions with the backlit fog around the birds. And then you want to move around to side light or front light once the sun gets high in the sky, and you don't want that extreme contrast with the backlight. So here we got that layers come through. And so what I want to do here now is jump in and do just a little develop work on the image. And I'm moving some panels you guys can't see around here. I'm going to jump in and just do my basic normal exposure settings. I'm holding down the J key and dragging the white slider to sort of right the point where I blow out whites. And I want some detail in the clouds. I may pull it back a little bit. I'm going to look at levels while I do this. Hold down the J key, pull down the blacks until I start losing the shadows. I want to have just a little bit of black in the image. That's pure black ink. And then I boost those shadows up just a little bit, get a little more detail, pull my highlights down. This is sort of the order I like to do everything in. And then I'm going to move that mid-tone slider around until I get a look that I like. It's just watching the image, not looking at the sliders. And I might pull the whites back just a little bit more to get a little more blue and detail in the sky. Just shift those white tones down into the highlights. And then, you know, I'm going to take a look at some presets here. And I'm in my sort of 2019 presets. This is a summery seeming scene to me. I'm going to go into my Death Valley summer presets. And as I look through this at the different potential presets, I'm looking at the sky, the color in the sky, kind of like clear sky. I sort of like rim light has a nice look to it. It's a little bit warm. Boom. That's a pretty decent look for me. And then, you know, whenever I use a preset, I always think of it as a starting point, not an end point. So I like to go through and look at what's going on in here. You know, I might look at this color enhancer, which appears to be working on blue, and darken up the blues, move them just a little more towards violet from aqua, and pull the saturation back just a little bit, maybe take the darkness down a little bit to bring a little more of that blue in the sky out. And then I think I'm going to take a look at the vignette filter that's in here. I'm going to pull its feather all the way down to where I can see it. And whenever I put a vignette filter in an effects preset, I always make it kind of big, and I would expect that anyone's going to customize it to the image at hand. It's just a suggestion. You could always junk it if it doesn't make sense to have a vignette too. But I'm going to readjust the size. I'm going to grab the little centering tool and move it right where I want, and then pull that feather back up to 100% so that it's subtle, and drop the brightness down to where I like it. And we have a look at what this thing looked like before and after. Really, really nice. Like, that's exactly what I was going for there. So I'm going to talk about a few more images here. I'm going to kill this left panel while that image loads. Let's see. Taking a second here. I think what it's doing is saving that layered on photo file in the background. So it might be good for another here.
Yeah, here's a great question. Do you have any safety tips when shooting wildlife? Have you ever had a scary experience yourself when out shooting at a cool place like this?
I have a really great story. I think you always, it's easy as a photographer to sort of forget about your own self-preservation at times. At least it is for me. And I have very nearly gotten myself in trouble with a bear. I was doing a backpacking trip through the Brooks Range in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge some years ago. I think now that I have kids and I'm a little bit older and wiser, I might have been a little more judicious about this kind of thing. But I was tired. I was backpacking with two friends, and we had pepper spray. One of us, I had a pistol just to make noise. And my other friend had an air horn, and we all sat down to take a little break, and this grizzly bear was shuffling along the other side of the river. It's a real narrow section of this river valley. We're heading up towards the Continental Divide and the Brooks Range, traversing the mountains. And, you know, I really wanted a photo of this bear. And so I ran away from my friends, leaving my pack and the pistol that I had with me behind, and got all the way to the narrowest point in this little gorge where he would be as close as possible to me on the other side, and crouched down to get a good shot, because I only had a 200mm lens, was the heaviest lens I was carrying. And I remember he was snuffling and not paying attention, you know, to anything except looking for tubers and marmot, or, you know, the ground squirrels up there. They're pretty rangy bears up in the Arctic. And I remember I wanted to get a picture of the bear's face, so I yelled, "Hey!" And this bear looked up, and I snapped the photo that I wanted. It was a good spot. There's cool composition. But then the next frame was him, you know, halfway down the bank coming toward me. It was a real terrifying experience. I stood up and screamed, and my friend started running towards me. And when the bear was almost at the water, he looked up and saw that there were three of us, that we were bigger than he'd expected, and took off the other way. But it was a lesson to me that, you know, you can get so involved in your photography that you forget about your own safety. And it's a really, really important, whether you're photographing wildlife or whether you're just taking pictures of your family. You know, there's a wonderful Magnum photographer, Martine Franck, who's just got wonderful, wonderful images. You should look her up sometime. She does beautiful portrait photography. And her father actually died taking a family photo, stepping back to get a better angle. He was a photographer off of a really high dike. And somehow she still became a photographer. So kind of amazing story. So, it is always important. I also think that, having a set of waders with you with felt bottoms so you have good footing in the water, if you're going to be working in water with landscape, knowing what the dangerous animals are wherever you happen to be, whether that's poisonous snakes or hippos or alligators or crocodiles, and being aware of what to look for and where to avoid being at what times. Those are all local knowledge. I think that's the best thing. Talking to someone who photographs in the area where you're going all the time about safety is always a great idea. All right, so I'm going to go back into my film strip mode here. And I'm actually going to jump back into browse because it'll be a little quicker moving through here. And I want to talk just for a second about light. This is in a little city park in Ashland, Oregon, and there were these cute ducklings swimming around. And I was thinking, wow, it's a bummer that it's just an ugly kind of, green city park pond. And as I stepped around to the other side of the pond, the light was just a little bit different. It's reflecting. So, if you think about water, walk in a circle around a puddle and look at, there's one part where just the angle that you're looking at it, there's no reflection at all. And then as you walk around the other side, just the way that the light's coming in the angle, now it's reflecting the trees and the leaves, that spring color that we had there onto the water. And with a polarizer, you can pop that reflection even more. So this is the same duckling, just me walking around the pond. Or it might have been one of its little sibling ducklings, but I mean, just that makes you think about what angle you are with the light with your subject. That's always really critical. If you're out in the forest, overcast is your friend. I remember going on this trip in Rwanda to photograph the mountain gorillas, and there was a woman who's a professional photographer, or she said at least, coming along on the trip, and she was complaining the whole time that it was cloudy. And I was thinking to myself, we're photographing black furred animals in the jungle. I think, there's nothing better than an overcast day. If it had been harsh sunlight in the middle of the day with the direct, hotly lit leaves and black shadows, especially back when I photographed this, I was using a Nikon D200, and it would have been impossible. There's just not enough dynamic range in that sensor. That the overcast was exactly what we needed. I think patience with wildlife is really, really important, and not moving in too quickly around animals. If you're photographing an animal, you have to sort of develop a relationship with that particular animal. So this is a crow out in the Petrified Forest National Park. And it was in the parking lot as I was coming back to the car after kind of touring through, looking at all the beautiful petrified wood. And it was just such a kind of cool day out on the plains with that low overcast, foggy atmospherics, nice soft light. And I just kept getting closer and closer, step by step. And, the crow was watching me the whole time. No sudden motions, just kind of slowly work your way in, take a photo, act nonchalant, look to the side, just really, really slow, careful motion. Same thing with this condor in Utah. This is one of the two populations of California condor that have been re-released into the wild. And I just, slowly moved in on this condor. I'm photographing with a 200 millimeter lens, a 1.7 teleconverter on compact sensor here. And, I was able to get in close enough to fill the top. But just really slowly. I think I took about a half an hour approaching that bird. This is a Patagonian fox, exact same technique, just really, really, really slowly. I mean, a step and then wait a while, no sudden motions. The minute you go reaching for something, you'll spook them. These are a couple seals in my workshop last year in Bandon. We were teaching the workshop in this hotel right by these beautiful sea stacks and rocks. And it just, that time of year, the seals were pupping, and there were all these mothers with brand new baby seals. And all of us moved in, and we talked about it a fair bit beforehand, and everyone just moved really slowly. And the moms just got used to us being there, and we were able to get in and photograph with 70 to 200 millimeter lenses, really nice and close up with these seals. Here's an extreme example. I got in the water up in the Fraser River in British Columbia with an underwater housing, and just laid still for an hour before these fish started coming around and treating me like I've been there forever. You know, I think it's the same thing with people. If you're out doing street photography, if you sit in one place long enough, you just become part of the landscape and people start flowing around you as if you're not there. And the same thing's true with wildlife. If wildlife is moving through an area and you just put yourself in the place that they're moving through, you'll see they go wide around you. They act as if there's something strange. And then if you don't move and if you don't act threatening in any way, after a while, they'll just act as if you're not there at all. I think sometimes when we're photographing, you know, sometimes you're after just that perfect look, that perfect moment. Sometimes just capturing that moment is what's really, really critical. It doesn't matter whether it's the most beautiful landscape or background. It's more about that instant, that moment. You know, here there's tension between the lion stalking the zebra. In reality, that zebra was looking up every 5 seconds, but I like the photo with, you know, it looking unawares. I was watching these lions stalk this zebra for about 4 minutes. The sun came out. They'd lay down and act lazy and start purring and licking their, you know, grooming themselves. And then the sun would go behind a cloud and they get super interested in the herd again. It was back and forth for about 40 minutes till I got tired of it and moved on. You know, other times you've just got to think about positioning yourself. You know, part of what you're doing is you're moving slowly around the wildlife, like this wild horse in Patagonia is just getting slowly moved around them without spooking them to where you get that background that you really want behind them. Here it's Cerro Torre and Mount Fitzroy. You know, this guanaco with one of the big peaks of Torres de Paine in the background. Patagonia is one of my favorite places to photograph landscape, wildlife, you name it. You know, here the Torres de Paine, that's what the park's named after in the background there with this herd of guanaco. And I kept going around these herds looking for, they were about to have babies, and it was an entire 10 days that I was there. And finally on the last day, some of the first babies started to come. It was spring down there. You know, these penguins, I traveled all the way down into Tierra del Fuego to visit a penguin colony, and it was just sort of disappointing because it's a group of molting penguins in grasses. This is about the best shot I could come up with. It's not super successful, but I did want to put a little snow behind them, and I had to move around to a really, really tough location and crawl on my stomach with a big 400mm lens to get any snow and ice with them, because it just looked so weird to have penguins in the grassland. It's like someone put them out in a Oregon farm field. It's just funny. Those moments, those just choice moments that happen. I was watching these two guanaco and I happened to have my camera out as this one went on the attack and went crazy like a cat racing around the house. It's really funny. And then finally, the last day, we did get baby guanaco, and I spent a good amount of time just kind of hovering around the herd, looking for a moment like this to capture. It's about patience, you know. This is in Africa, obviously, this little baby baboon. I was photographing it for half an hour because it was such a cute baby, but there was just this one instant where, you know, you've just got to be ready and have your finger on the shutter and be watching. Here's another one that I want to edit and show some of the power of photo raw. So this is on my South Carolina, my Charleston, South Carolina workshop last year. We're going to be doing that again this spring with my good friend David Archer, who's just an amazing bird and wildlife photographer. And we do a lot of wildlife photography in that particular workshop. And this is at the South Carolina Raptor Rehabilitation Center, where he's really good friends with the people there. And they flew birds for us as a private group. And, you know, I want to just showcase some of the power of photo raw to clean up distractions here. You know, this is a great horned owl flying in at us here. And the first thing I want to do, I want to crop this image a bit, and I want to straighten it a little bit. I'm going to grab my level tool and just kind of drag it along the horizon there, along the bushes, to just get this image straightened up. And then I'm going to pull this down to where it really fills the frame with our owl, primarily here, just like that. Yep, right about there. And I'm going to hit enter. And then I want to go in here with my perfect eraser brush. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to get rid of this perch that the owl's taking off from, and just paint it out of the scene. Really careful. Right, that line between it and the owl is important there. Here we go. Oop. One move got rid of most of it. Just take out that little bit here at the bottom. Bam, pretty amazing. I just love the perfect eraser tool in Photo Raw. And then I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in. Now let's go to 100%. And this is from my Nikon D500, it's not my big megapixel camera. I'm gonna use that same tool, I'm gonna shrink it down a little bit, and I wanna get rid of this little radio antenna that's here on the bird's back. And call that a distraction. Here it goes. Whoop. Good enough. I'm gonna go back to my fit view here. And now in edit, I wanna go ahead and I'm gonna do my normal thing. I'm gonna hit the J key so I can see the highlights, pull them back to where they're not blowing out. I might even go a little bit more just to get a little more blue preserved in the sky. Black tones, there we go into the shadows. I don't mind a little bit of black under the bird there. And then I'm gonna boost shadows just a wee bit here. Pull a little more detail out of the wings. Pull the highlights back just a touch. I'll move that mid-tone slider, watching the image as I do it to where it looks just kind of nice to taste for me. And that's looking pretty great. I might just zoom in on the bird's face. I'm going to get out of the perfect eraser first and click into my zoom tool. And I'm going to just go in and sharpen a little bit. It's almost razor sharp. It's just a little bit off. But I'm going to go into detail here. I'm going to hold down my Option key while I do this and just pull the sharpening amount up. I like to hold down the Option so I get a black and white view while I do that. I'm going to jump up to about 50 here and just get a little sharpening built in there. Jump back out, and I'm going to go over to Effects. And here in Effects, I don't particularly want to add any dynamic contrast anywhere except the bird's face. So here's where I think the power of this layered effects workflow comes in. And I'm going to go ahead and use a style that I've created that turns down from its natural setting even just a little bit more. And I don't want this image wide. I don't like what it's doing to all the out of focus details, how it's putting little crunchy details in there when what I really want is soft out of focus details. So what I'm going to do is invert this mask so that it's putting a black mask. Nothing in black is showing. And then I want to go with my masking tool and I actually want to paint in instead of paint out. Again, I want my opacity at 100%. I want my feather at 100%. So it's a nice soft edge, no harsh edges to what I'm painting here. I'm going to just paint the owl's face back in with some dynamic contrast. Reduce that down. I might paint just the bit of his wings that are sharp here. There's kind of some motion blur and some aperture blur going on here at the same time. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a blur enhancing filter. And I want to take a look at the different styles that are in here. And I have a feeling that I'm going to go with desert. I like desert a lot. It adds kind of a little bit of warmth and it boosts the orange tones a bit. I think fall might overdo it. Foliage would make the forest really green, maybe too green in this case. I am going to go with desert here. And another thing I want to do, his eye, his left eye, right eye as we're looking at it, is a little dark. So I'm going to jump in here in local adjustments and I'm going to turn exposure up a bit. Let's say maybe 1 exposure value, something like that. I want to zoom in here to 100% again. I want to grab my perfect eraser brush and I'm going to drop my opacity down to about 30%. I'm basically kind of dodging and burning here. I'm going to really reduce the size of this brush down to a very tiny brush, but I got the perfect eraser on, so it's going to just really work. If I don't take the crosshair outside the eye, it's really going to just paint in around the eye here. I'm going to make a few passes and just brighten that eye up just a little bit. Maybe just one more. And then the nice thing is once I've got that painted in there, I can brighten the eye or darken the eye with that slider. I can kind of go in post-mortem and change the setting. And that looks pretty balanced to me. We drop back out in my fit view. It's a big change. I might drop its opacity. Just that's another thing I can do, just a touch. It should be slightly shadowed, but I just didn't want it as dark as it was. That looks much, much better. All right, so jumping back into effects. I love how you can just bounce around here. One more filter, and it's that, you know, Broken Record Hudson vignette filter. The big softy is the setting I like to start with. I drop the feather down again. I can adjust the roundness. I kind of want a bit of as much of a kind of oval that as I can get there. I'm going to make it a little smaller so it's more about the owl himself. I don't care if the wingtips get a little bit darkened in this scene. It looks like a vignette. I'm going to grab that centering tool and just move it so it's right over him, pull that feather back up. And I want this one to be pretty subtle. You know, that's pretty extreme at 100 down brightness. I want to pull it back to maybe, I'm going to guess somewhere in like the 25. Yeah, right in there. And if we take a look at what we looked like before and after, not even taking into account getting rid of that, all those distractions, it's a pretty darn big difference. So I'm going to go back to my grid view here. One of my favorite things that they did, oops, I hit it twice, is the ability to jump back into the library or into the browse app with just pressing the G key and go to the grid view. Back to film strip. So there we go. You want to take a question after that at all, Michael?
Yeah, we actually we have 2 bird questions specifically, if you want to take those.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Yeah, so a question from Bob comes through is, what is the most important focus point on birds? I'm guessing the eyes, to have some reflection in their eyes. Do you try to get reflection on purpose?
I do, and the eye is absolutely the most important part. And one thing that would have been nice in this shot that would have caused me to not necessarily need to do that local adjustment have been to have a big high power on camera flash on with what's known as a better beamer. Give me one sec, I think I got one right. No, it's not on the shelf where it normally is. But it's essentially just this attachment that goes on a flash, and it's got a Fresnel lens on the front of it that amplifies the light signal. And so it makes your flash even more intense. So when you're photographing a bird from a distance, it'll just put a little catch light in the eye. It's a really nice tool. They're only like $30, $40. So that's a great tool to have on a flash while you're out specifically photographing birds. And you definitely want to focus on the eye.
And then one more question about birds specifically. Do you have any sharpening tips specific for our feathered friends? Dynamic contrast sometimes can seem a little too much or too crude. Do you have a preferred refined sharpening method?
You know, whenever I do sharpening, and I'm going to jump into this photograph of this marmot that I had lined up here because it needs a little bit of sharpening and a little bit of noise reduction. And as I jump in here, I mean, birds, marmots, animals with fur, whatever, you know, they all are going to be individual images. There's no just recipe for sharpening or noise reduction that's going to be the end all and be all that's going to slay every image that you have a problem with, because each one's just slightly different. Exposure settings are different, the light's different, the tones in the image are different. But I think as a general rule, here's what I would say on sharpening, and I'll show you sort of my method. There's a little bit of noise in this image, and I need to get rid of that and do some sharpening. And that's pretty common, especially when we're working with high shutter speeds to capture birds. Often the ISO gets bumped up and you got a little noise that you have to deal with. And to get rid of the noise, you need to introduce some micro blur, and that micro blur removes sharpness. So it's a kind of the 2 sides of the same coin, noise reduction and sharpening. And it's just this thing you have to do zoomed into 100% like I am right here. And I would argue that for most images, unless they're shot at really high ISO and they look grainy, you know, small on your screen, if you're just sharing them on the internet, if you're just, you know, putting them up in a web gallery, if they're going to be not printed bigger than say 8x10, there probably isn't really much need to worry about sharpening. You're never going to notice on Facebook or Flickr whether or not an image has been sharpened and noise reduced or not. It's when you go to print something larger or display it really big, you know, some huge HD TV, that you're going to start noticing those flaws. And so, you know, I don't do this with each and every image. It's really more of a portfolio image exercise. In this case, there's a bit of noise here in this image. So I'm going to go I'm in edit here. I'm going down to the details panel, and I want to hold down the option key and just drag that luminance slider first thing and try to get rid of some of that noise that I'm seeing in the bokeh area on this image. And you see that we're losing a little sharpness in Mr. Marmot's eye while we do that. So then, you know, one thing I do, you're going to pull to really do noise reduction, the way ON1's set up, you move luminance out to say the midpoint. It's not where you're going to leave it. And then you grab the detail slider, you start moving that detail slider. See how things get there. There's the noise. There's noise over here. There's a certain point where that detail slider is going to hit the frequency of noise that you're trying to get rid of in your scene. Now it's just gotten smooth right there. And then we're going to control the amount of noise reduction by pulling back on that luminance, that right size of detail. So I'm coming back, yeah, right in there. And then I want to keep holding that down. I think it's easier to do all this with a black and white mask. I'm going to move sharpening up till I'm just watching the eye and the fur. Now, you know, part of this marmot's out of focus. It's really just the eye. It's a pretty wide aperture that I'm working with here with a fast shutter speed in case he goes moving. And I think, you know, right around 50 again. If I had to say my most frequent setting for both my Nikon D850 and my Nikon D500, then I'm pretty sure this is the D500, is around 50. And then I'm going to grab the threshold slider, and that's going to show me whether or not I'm sharpening any noise. You know, if I hadn't done luminance noise reduction, you'd see all kinds of grainy pattern in that image that I'd be sharpening the noise at the same time as I'm sharpening the marmot. This is letting me say set a mask on what size detail is it that I want to be sharpening. And as I move it, I'm saying I really just only want to sharpen the marmot's fur. I don't want to be sharpening any of those out of focus details in the back. And boom, that's the way I sharpen pretty much each and every image that I work on. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's perfect, man. So do you want me to keep reading you some questions, or do you want to keep going on? It's up to you.
Let's go with some more questions at this point.
Okay. Do you have opinions on traveling solo versus with partners or groups while shooting wildlife?
Well, it's tricky. You know, this marmot is a great example because this was taken this last summer in my Mount Rainier National Park workshop, and I had about, gosh, I don't know, there were like 11 of us running around photographing this marmot at the same time. We had another car with a couple people show up, and you know, the just making sure that you get on the same page with everyone that you're with about not making sudden movements, about being respectful of one another. I think that's a huge thing. It's a great question, because wildlife photography is a little different than other aspects of photography. If you're out with a group, you got to make sure that you're all on the same page and that you're going to work together, and that if one person's got that relationship that I was talking about with an animal, and you're slowly working, you're really trying to get your image, and you've been engaged. Maybe you've been working with it for half an hour, and somebody else from the group comes walking up, you know, runs in and spooks the animal, and you just wasted half an hour trying to get in the right spot or just get that relationship going. So being really respectful of one another, whether that's a person that's with you in your group or whether that's someone from another group or another individual out photographing, you kind of have to take turns with animals. Animals aren't going to want a big group all moving in around. Now, we were really lucky. Partly Mount Rainier National Park is filled with marmots, and they're all generally very tame because it's a national park and no people have been bothering them for, you know, 100 years in there. Well, not 100 years, but a long time. And so generations of marmots, they look at us like a source of peanuts, raisins, and trail mix by people. But we did work as a group really, really carefully, and, you know, nobody rushing, nobody making sudden motion, and all of us were able to get nice images of this marmot from different angles. And I love photographing with groups. It's one of my absolute favorite things because you all learn from one another, particularly if you're sharing images. You know, that's a big I do in my workshops is I want to make sure that each day we're looking at everyone's images, at their favorite images from the day before, and seeing how different people with different eyes see the same thing, and you all learn from one another. So I think that it depends on the group, and you have to make sure that everyone's on the same page. But I think it's wonderful to photograph anything in groups because you all learn from one another and you come away from it with a new eye and new appreciation, new skills, and new friends. So yeah, I would argue that photographing in groups is wonderful. Again, the right groups.
Good tips for sure. While we're on the subject of traveling and everything like that, what is equipment that you see as essential for lengthy travels?
Wildlife specific, if wildlife is on the radar, and I love having a big long lens with me. And lately, more and more, I've been, this is an old manual focus 400. Sometimes I rent, an even bigger lens, and I keep eyeballing the used Nikon 400 2.8s. It's an amazing lens, but it takes a backpack to carry. So it's all kind of, there are different considerations. If you're going to be hiking and you want to photograph wildlife, getting some of these newer, not quite as low in aperture lenses are a great idea. I love this Nikon 300 f4. It's so small and light. I can actually drop it nose down in my think tank photo bags, and in my f-stop photo bag it doesn't quite do that, but the think tanks I can. And it's just razor sharp, and like I said, it works just fine with a 1.4 teleconverter. So finding something smaller and lighter to travel with is a really nice deal. I think that for those of you who are traveling and want to stay a little light, think about the fact that these newer cameras have such great high ISO performance that maybe your longer lenses don't need to be as wide in aperture as they used to in the old days. Because if you bounce up to, 2000 ISO now, you get great noise. I think this Marmot shot was at 2000 ISO with my Nikon D500, and that's a crop sensor camera. I've been photographing with this new little Nikon Z6, partly because I wanted high ISO noise performance, and partly because I want the video capabilities for doing a lot of the tutorial stuff that I do. And its high ISO has just been blowing my mind, up at 20,000. It's just incredible. This was 2000. I might have misspoken. 2000 ISO. I'm 20,000. This thing's incredible. However, I haven't found a mirrorless camera yet that competes for autofocus tracking, particularly in burst capture mode, like the Nikons and Canons and SLRs. Now, I know the Sony A9 is supposed to be significantly better. I haven't used it, so I can't speak to that one. But there's no way I would go after wildlife with just a mirrorless right now. I definitely would be holding on to my Nikon D500 for that. Just the 10 frames a second and the ability to track fast motion and fast erratic motion in that group autofocus continuous mode is unparalleled for me. I know the Nikon D5 is potentially even better. My friend David, the birder that I'll be going to South Carolina with this spring, he loves his D5 for birds. So I think having a camera that does good autofocus tracking for wildlife, particularly if you're a birder, is important. A high frame rate is important. A long lens is important because, let's face it, real wildlife out there doesn't want you to get too close. You can work and work and work to get closer and closer and closer. But, one of the techniques for that, like I said, is, get that first shot and then just carefully, slowly, cautiously move a little closer and take another shot, because you never know at what point they're going to spook. So you just keep refining it until you get where you really want. And hopefully, if you're really slow and really patient, you're going to get there. Traveling, I like to have a heavy duty tripod. It doesn't have to weigh a ton. This whole setup right here, this is my Manfrotto fluid head. I have a bunch of videos on my YouTube channel about these. It weighs exactly the same as a Really Right Stuff BH55 ball head. It's 2 pounds. This is a 4.5 pound tripod, so 6.5 pounds. But I take a big duffel bag and I put clothes, around it. And I got that guy pops out, and I carry my camera bag with my gear on. And like I said, these slightly slower apertures, f4 lenses can really cut down. If I think about what an older 300 millimeter fixed lens look like, they're much bigger, much heavier, don't fit in your camera bag well. So that's my advice for traveling.
Awesome. There's actually a question on Nikon group focus. Do you use group focus? If so, how many focus points do you use in the group?
I think it's 9. It's the one with the diamond around the central focus point. And I do use that for birds, particularly for birds in flight. For anything that I'm trying to pick up erratic motion, I use it for, photographing kids in the playground. For fast moving subjects, nothing picks up and nails focus faster than that group autofocus that Nikon has. And I do like the diamond. I think it's 9, group 9.
Nice. So it looks like questions are wrapping up, but there is one on using filters. There's actually 2. Do you recommend using filters, and what are some guidelines for the best times and best practices to use filters for wildlife?
Okay, so I think if you're photographing in the forest, let's say you're in the forest in bright enough conditions that it's not going to rob you of critical shutter speed. A polarizer, particularly in a wet forest, say a wet, foggy forest, is going to cut through the reflections on wet vegetation and just bring out the greens in that vegetation. So forest photos look much more vivid with a polarizer. You slap it on, turn it, and you'll see everything get more colorful. Again, if it's really low light, that polarizer is also going to reduce the amount of light coming through it into your sensor. So you're going to have to have a slower shutter speed or a wider aperture. So, pull it if you're getting too slow a shutter speed. Out in the day, I think, an hour after the sunrise, an hour before the sunset, and in the middle, if you've got the sun off to one side, left or right, it's going to add color, add contrast, add pop, just increase the color saturation and contrasting your scene to have a polarizer. You just have to keep turning it. If you're moving around erratically, photographing wildlife in all different directions, I would say don't use it. I mean, it's just going to wind up robbing you of shutter speed, and you're not going to have time to constantly be shifting it to get the most out of it. If you're in a landscape type scene with wildlife and there are reflections on the water and you're pointing out into the water, that polarizer is going to let you control reflections on the surface, whether you want to intensify them like the duckling in the pond that I showed the photo of, or whether you want to get rid of them and see the bottom. That polarizer lets you do all that. I would argue too that, in places where there's wind and sand entrained in wind, like the beach on a windy day, or water blowing up from surf and wind, anything like that, I'm going to really recommend that you think about a high quality UV filter. And for years and years and years, I was of that mind that, why put a cheap piece of glass in front of a really expensive lens, until I had to replace a few front elements. And Hoya Filters approached me about becoming an ambassador and wanted me to test their HD3 UV filters. They're not cheap, but they really, I've done all kinds of tests and I haven't seen any image degradation, even shooting straight into the sun in backlight doing sun stars. They're just a really, really high-end piece of glass. That's why they're expensive. They're also like iPhone glass. They're like sapphire iPhone glass. I mean, I have no problem whatsoever cleaning them with a t-shirt. That I can't seem to scratch them. I had a situation where I had a lens take a dive and bent the filter ring on a UV filter, and I couldn't get it off. And I took a pair of channel locks, pliers, and dug in and got a hold and bent it out and then spun it off. And when I looked at it, I've been scraping these pliers across the glass, and I couldn't see any marks on the glass. So that tells you a little something. So I think that there are times when you want a protective filter on there just because the front element of your lens costs a lot and takes a lot of time to get repaired. You don't always need it, but it's a nice thing to have. Plus, I don't know how many times I still inadvertently, think I've got the lens cap on and reach in and touch the glass. And it's nice to just be able to buff it off with a t-shirt or a microfiber cloth and not worry about harming the coatings on there. So those are my thoughts on filters. That and neutral density filters for landscape are really the only filters I carry anymore. I don't feel the need for graduated filters and all those things. I think the polarizer is your friend in certain situations, but just remember, it's also going to rob you of exposure value and shutter speed in other situations. So just use it thoughtfully.
Awesome. So last question here that we'll take from Bob is, what methods do you use to keep birds in focus as they are flying?
Yeah, so that continuous autofocus in the group mode. I'm a Nikon photographer, and Canon has kind of a similar mode with their cameras. Also works well. I think Nikon's autofocus might be just a little bit better. It's having that group mode is really nice because, like I said, you've got a diamond of autofocus points around the one that you've selected. And if any one of those touch something, that it's going to pick the closest thing in the frame that they're touching and snap autofocus on that. And then it'll hold them in. And you want to have the dynamic setting on your autofocus that'll allow, well, that's automatic in group autofocus. Never mind. Just let it off as the subject moves through the frame. If you're not keeping it perfectly tracked, it'll know where it is and keep moving it between the different autofocus points that are available. And you just track, and because you want to be in that burst mode, continuous high speed, and with a camera like this, snap, you got it, you keep tracking it, and you just fire. That's my technique. Now, one thing that's interesting, I've been testing this new Nikon Z6, and I love its image quality and its ability to capture scenes in low light. But when I've tried to use its burst mode, it doesn't have a group autofocus mode, but it does have continuous tracking mode, and it catches a subject pretty well, and it tracks it pretty well. And the first frame I fire is razor sharp and in focus, but then somewhere between capturing the image and going to the next frame, it loses the subject, and you'll wind up with a couple of blurry images, and then it catches it again, and then a couple blurry images, and then it catches it again. So that's why I say, if your primary focus is birds and wildlife, this can be a great camera to run around with and do your cityscape and night shooting and landscapes and all that stuff, or the Z7 too. But I would stick with the D5, D500 and D850 if you're a Nikon person doing birds and wildlife. I feel the same way about the Sonys that I've used too. I have the A6500, I have the original A7S, and in workshops, invariably, I've had just about every Sony come through. One of my good friends, DC, brought an A9 to Death Valley, and I really wished I'd had it. I'd taken a little time to mess with it. That's the one I haven't spent time with, and its autofocus is supposed to be significantly better. But I can say definitively that I've used a lot of cameras, and I feel like probably the D5 has the best autofocus out there, followed by the D500, and the ability to fire off bursts of 10 frames a second and just have every single one razor sharp as your subject's moving. That group mode is the way to go. Awesome.
So one last quick question actually for you. Can you restate the brand of the fluid head that you're using?
Yeah, so I have one thing, if you go to my YouTube channel, just search for Hudson Henry on YouTube. If you search Hudson Henry fluid head on YouTube, you're going to find several videos. The most recent one I did is ATS, it's either 001 or 002. I have this weekly series on YouTube I'm doing on Thursdays called Approaching the Scene, the free videos. And there's one with my latest thoughts on fluid heads. It's wonderful for landscape, but it's great for everything, including replacing a gimbal for me for this kind of stuff. It weighs exactly the same as a Really Right Stuff BH55, and it costs somewhere, the price varies depending on demand at the moment, but it goes down to $110 and up to about $160. So it's a sweet deal. And if you'll jump in and look at, it's a Manfrotto 500 AH, but I have links. And if you go to that video, I think it's ATS 001 or 002, go check that out. It's from this year. And I'll show you everything about how to adapt it so that you can easily drop an L bracket on it with the Arca Swiss clamp, and I have all the parts and everything laid out in a kit for putting that thing together.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Hudson, I think that's pretty much all that we have time for today. So why don't you give us some final parting words here before I close everything down?
I love photographing wildlife. I would say that at my core, I'm sort of an adventure travel photographer. That's my roots. My roots are traveling around the Cascade Mountains and going on trips to other mountain ranges and coasts, and photographing the landscapes, the rivers, the mountains, and all of the animals that are within. And I think I grew up on some of Art Wolf's wildlife photography and Galen Rowell. And, there's just nothing more fun than getting out and connecting with wild nature. And I really think that just spending time out there is the biggest key. We can talk about camera settings and editing and everything else, but being out there, it's good for the soul. And the more that you're out there, the more photos you're going to capture and the more situations you're going to find And I'd say that the biggest parting word I have is to just be respectful of that wildlife and respectful of the other people out enjoying it, whether they're photographers or just other nature lovers. But I think it's just good for the soul.
Definitely. Good tips. Thank you so much, Hudson. This has been an awesome webinar. For everyone who's still with us, this has been recorded. You can go check it out right now on our YouTube channel. We'll have it posted to our blog later this afternoon. Otherwise, that's all I have, Hudson. Thank you so much for being here with everyone. I'm going to close down the webinar right now. Everyone, have a great day.
Hey, thanks, everybody. It was a real pleasure.
Cheers, guys.